She knew the law, she upheld it. But when a power-hungry cop pulled her over and refused to acknowledge who she was, the situation took a dangerous turn, until karma struck back. The road was nearly empty, just an endless stretch of highway cutting through the darkness. The sleek black sedan glided steadily along the right lane. Veronica Caldwell had been driving for almost an hour, her mind still occupied with the debriefing she had just left. Being the newly appointed director of the FBI meant long hours, endless meetings, tense negotiations, and the constant need to assess every minor risk that could turn into a catastrophe. But she was prepared for that. What she wasn't expecting was the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as her eyes flicked to the speedometer. Exactly 65. Not a mile over. No erratic movements, no violations. She knew that for a fact. And yet, the patrol car remained behind her, making no attempt to pass. Exhaling through her nose, Veronica turned on her right signal and smoothly guided the car to the shoulder. Years of experience told her there was nothing to worry about. She had worked with law enforcement her entire career, knew the protocols, understood the system. But when the patrol car stopped behind her, something in her mind tensed. Why was the officer hesitating? As she adjusted her rearview mirror, trying to get a look at him. Finally, the door of the patrol vehicle swung open. The man who stepped out was unfamiliar to her, not surprising. She didn't expect to know every street cop in the state, but something about the way he moved put her on edge immediately. His stance was rigid, his steps deliberate yet heavy. There was a hidden aggression in the way he carried himself. His left hand rested on his belt, fingers curled near his holster. His right hand swung a flashlight, sharp beams of light slicing across the pavement ahead of him. Veronica pressed the button to lower her window and deliberately placed both hands on the steering wheel. "Evening, officer." Her voice was even, professional, revealing not a hint of irritation. The cop looked down at her, his flashlight flicking up to her face. The beam lingered too long, too intrusive. Veronica suppressed an annoyed sigh. This wasn't normal. "May I ask why I was stopped?" She kept her tone steady, void of emotion. The officer chewed his gum, studying her face for a fraction longer than necessary, then spoke lazily. "Registration and license." Veronica didn't move. Her instincts, the ones that had saved her life more than once in her career, told her this wasn't going to be a routine stop. She knew how quickly a situation could spiral out of control. She needed to maintain command before things turned dangerous. "Sir, I'm reaching for my purse on the passenger seat." No reaction. Moving slowly, she retrieved her wallet and handed over both her FBI credentials and driver's license. The officer didn't take them. His gaze lingered on her badge for a second before flicking back to her face. His expression remained unchanged. "FBI, huh?" She nodded. "Yes, sir?" Silence. "Step out of the car." The words were quiet but sharp, like a slap. Veronica blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer took half a step back, but now his right hand hovered near his holster. Tension thickened in the air, pressing against her ribs. There was no reason for this. She had followed protocol, identified herself, complied with his request for documentation. And yet, this man, this officer, was treating her as a threat. She had seen this before. Not personally, not like this. But she had read the reports, seen the footage. She knew how quickly things could turn tragic. She wasn't about to become another headline. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind raced through possibilities. She knew how to survive. She knew every move she made could alter the outcome. But before she could decide on her next step, the officer reached for her door handle. Only then did she understand. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was something else entirely. But fear didn't dictate her actions, because she had spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this, and she wasn't about to back down. The sharp click of the door handle cut through her thoughts. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a razor-sharp awareness. Her left hand shot forward, gripping the inner handle before he could open the door. "Step back," she said firmly but steadily. "You're overstepping protocol, Officer Cairns." Cairns didn't flinch. His grip on the door tightened, knuckles whitening. "I said, step out of the car." Now she heard it. Not just in his words, but in the way he spoke. In his need to dominate, to make her feel powerless, dependent on his will. She had encountered men like him before, but this one had a badge, a gun, and a personality that made him truly dangerous. She tightened her hold on the door handle, her body still, but her mind calculating. For the first time, Cairns hesitated. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he chose a different action, one far worse. He stepped forward, raising the flashlight straight into her face, blinding her, cutting her off from her surroundings, leaving only his blurred silhouette in her vision. The light didn't waver. It didn't shift an inch, trapping her in artificial darkness. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he muttered. She didn't blink. "Actually, you do." Cairns' jaw tightened. His lips pressed into a thin line. But the beam didn't move. Yet, his confidence wavered. Her words had unsettled him. He wanted her to be afraid. But fear was something Veronica Caldwell refused to feel. She wouldn't let him take full control of this situation. "Then let's call your supervisor and see if he agrees," she said calmly. The words were ice cold, each syllable laced with quiet confidence. Cairns didn't respond. The flashlight wavered. The beam shifted away. But before she could exhale, a loud bang shattered the air. His hand slammed down hard on the roof of her car. The sharp, crude smack echoed through the empty road like a punch to the chest. "I said, get out." For the first time, her gaze truly focused on him. She memorized every detail. Her fingers itched to grab her phone, but she didn't move. She knew how easily any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. She had seen it happen too many times before. Her hands remained visible. Her stare was steel, cold, assessing, the same look she gave suspects during interrogations. "You're making a mistake." Cairns let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you can use your title against me?" And that's when she saw it. The shift in his posture, the twitch of his right hand toward his belt. He was considering it. The space between them thickened, turned suffocating. And then, a second car pulled up. Red and blue lights sliced through the darkness as another patrol vehicle stopped behind Cairns' car. Her first reaction was relief. Another officer, another witness. Accountability. But then she saw who stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, another white officer, his nameplate obscured by the glare of headlights. Cairns didn't even turn around. This wasn't backup. This was reinforcement. The second officer walked up to Cairns, his gaze sweeping the scene before settling on the problem. "What's going on here?" Cairns smirked. "Just dealing with a non-compliant driver." Veronica stayed silent, giving herself a fraction of a second to weigh her options. Now, she was outnumbered, and Cairns knew it. The second officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Not Director Caldwell, not Miss Caldwell. Just ma'am. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a high-stakes negotiation overseas. This wasn't a tactical mission gone wrong. This was home. And right now, home felt just as dangerous. She inhaled slowly, calculating. By tomorrow, it wouldn't be her facing scrutiny. It would be them. She felt the tension settle deep in her bones, heavy, suffocating. Behind her, the second officer stood silent, a display of quiet solidarity. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about power. Her fingers rested on the steering wheel. She could read them like an open book. They wanted escalation. If she complied, she was at their mercy. No good options. Tension thickened in the air, turning dense with anticipation. She knew they were watching her every move under a microscope. She knew any misstep could become justification for actions later labeled as necessary force. She couldn't show weakness, but she couldn't give them an excuse either. "Ma'am." The second officer's voice was deceptively calm. "Step out of the vehicle." Veronica exhaled slowly through her nose, forcing down the instinct screaming inside her. She had negotiated situations where a single wrong word meant death. She had to stay in control. Deliberately. Unhurriedly. She reached for the door handle, raising her other hand where they could see it. Kern stepped back slightly, giving her just enough space, and the moment her feet touched the pavement, the cold night air struck her skin like a slap, sinking through her clothes, digging into her muscles, sharpening every sensation. She was vulnerable. Kearns loomed over her, his body angled just enough to block the dashcam's view. The second officer remained a step behind, covering all blind spots. They had planned this. She had no doubt. It wasn't their first time. "Don't move," Kearns ordered. "You haven't told me why I'm being detained." Her voice was steady, but steel ran beneath it. Kearns smirked, shaking his head as if she weren't a person, just an obstacle to remove. "Suspicious behavior," he said flatly. "What behavior?" She didn't look away. Failure to comply. It was a trap. Failure to comply justified escalation. Compliance meant submission. She knew the rules of this game. She had read the reports. She had seen the statistics. And then, Kearns grabbed her wrist. Too hard. Too fast. Her instincts reacted before she could think. She pulled back, not aggressively, but enough. "Get your hands off me," she snapped. Her voice cut through the night like a gunshot. Kearns didn't let go. The second officer stepped in. "We got a problem here." Kearns tightened his grip. "Think she's resisting." Those words made Veronica's stomach twist. The second officer reached for his radio, his lips already parting to say the words that had justified so many senseless escalations before. "Non-compliant suspect." Not citizen, not federal agent, just suspect. And then she saw it. The gun. Kearns didn't hesitate. His hand moved to his holster. The snap of the clasp. And then the barrel, just inches from her face. Time stretched thin, warped around them. She had been trained for crisis situations. She had faced warlords, domestic terrorists, ruthless criminals. But this wasn't war. This was an empty road in the middle of the night. And she was unarmed. A crushing weight filled her chest. Not fear, not for herself. For every name she had ever read in those reports. For those who never got to tell their side of the story. Her vision narrowed for a split second. She opened her mouth, choosing words that could have been her last. But before she could speak, a voice sliced through the night. "Hey, I'm recording this." The tension shattered like glass. Those words weren't just words. They were power. Someone had seen. And more importantly, someone had proof. Kearns didn't lower the gun. But his body wavered. A flicker, small, but she caught it. Hesitation. A quick glance to the side, to the source of the voice. She followed his eyes, turning her head slightly. A man stood at the edge of the road, phone held up, the screen's glow reflecting in his glasses. He was at a safe distance, but close enough to capture everything. Close enough to make sure this moment wouldn't vanish into the shadows like thousands before it. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" His voice was calm, but Veronica heard the weight in it. Not a threat, a reality. Kern's jaw clenched. He said nothing. The second officer stepped forward, slower now, calculating. They weren't in control anymore. She saw it in their eyes. The shift, the panic pressing against their authority. They were used to silence, to impunity. But this was different. This was recorded. Kearns exhaled sharply. His fingers still gripped the gun's handle, but his next move would decide everything. Veronica knew she had to push. "Lower your weapon!" Her voice cut through the air, hard as steel. Kearns didn't move. His breathing was shallow, his mind scrambling for an exit. The second officer's radio crackled. "Unit 47, status check." Another beat of silence, and then sirens. Faint, but getting closer. Backup, but not the kind they needed. Kearns' grip loosened. His hand dropped slightly. He didn't holster his weapon, but he wasn't aiming it at her anymore. He turned to the second officer. "Make him stop recording." Veronica's stomach clenched. She knew what that meant. The second officer moved toward the witness, his hand drifting toward his belt. "No, not this time." Veronica stepped forward, her voice cracking like a whip. "Touch him, and I will personally charge you with obstruction of justice." That stopped him. For the first time, uncertainty hung in the air. The balance of power had shifted, just slightly, but enough. The sirens were deafening now. Kearns was no longer looking at her, he was looking past her, at the approaching lights. She knew that look, desperation, and desperate men made reckless choices. She had seconds, only seconds, to get out of this alive. Would it be enough? The sirens howled, echoing against the empty road. Red and blue strobes painted the night in chaotic swirls. Several patrol cars screeched to a halt. Doors flung open, officers stepped out. Tense, cautious. Hands hovered over holsters, but weapons remained sheathed. They didn't know what they were walking into. Veronica didn't dare move. She could see the witness standing motionless. His phone's red recording light glowed, an unblinking eye capturing every second. Kearns still held his gun. But the arrogance, the unwavering confidence had drained from his face. Now, there was something else. Panic, calculations, fear of consequences. And then, one name cut through the tension like a bullet. "Caldwell!" It came from one of the officers, a lieutenant, judging by the insignia on his uniform. He recognized her instantly. The situation shifted. The second officer tensed, his mouth opening, but no words came out. He understood. Everything had changed. The lieutenant's gaze swept over the scene. Veronica stood with her hands raised. Kearns still gripped his gun. The second officer stood frozen in hesitation. And then, the sharp click of a camera. The witness kept filming, documenting every second. Veronica slowly lowered her hands, not in surrender, in defiance. Her voice was firm. "Lieutenant, I want these officers placed under arrest, right now." The second officer took a step back. "Wait." But Veronica cut him off before he could finish. No more words. Her voice was a razor, slicing through any excuse he was trying to form. "I know what this was, and so does he." She gestured toward the witness. The camera remained locked on them. She saw the gears turning in their heads, analyzing, weighing the consequences. This was bigger than a bad stop. This was career-ending for anyone who tried to bury it. Kearns understood first. His fingers finally uncurled. Slowly, controlled. He let the gun slide back into the holster. His face burned red, fury twisting his features. He met Veronica's gaze, but this time, she wasn't the one afraid. "This is a misunderstanding," he muttered. His voice was quiet, hollow, like he already knew how pathetic the excuse sounded. Veronica tilted her head slightly. "Oh? Then let's clear it up at headquarters." She turned to the lieutenant. "Call internal affairs. Call the DA. This isn't going away." The second officer swallowed hard. His face paled. He knew they had lost. The lieutenant finally moved. A sharp nod to the nearest officer, a single click of handcuffs shattered the night. Kearns and his partner were no longer the hunters. Now, they were the ones answering for their actions. Kearns exhaled sharply. "You've got to be kidding me." His voice was raw, thick with disbelief. The kind of disbelief that hits a man who has always gotten away with it. Until now. Veronica didn't flinch. "You pointed a gun at the director of the FBI, Officer Kearns." She let the words sink in. "Let me know if you'd like to add resisting arrest to your list of charges." She had spent her entire career watching justice almost happen, watching cases drown in bureaucracy, watching victims become suspects. Not tonight. Kearns's breaths were shallow as the cuffs locked around his wrists. The second officer didn't resist. He just stared at the ground, like a man who finally realized he had bet on the wrong side. The lieutenant turned to her. "Director?" His voice was careful. She didn't hesitate. "Get them out of my sight." And just like that, it was over. Or at least this part was. Because Veronica knew this wasn't just about two bad cops. This was about the system that allowed them to thrive. And she wasn't about to let it go. But what happened next? That was bigger than this night. The handcuffs on Kearns' wrists weren't just cold metal. They were the weight of consequences he had dodged his entire career. He stood frozen, disbelief twisting his face, as officers led him and his partner toward the waiting patrol cars. He still thought this wouldn't stick. Veronica had seen that look before. Men like him always believed themselves untouchable, until they weren't. She inhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay in control. Anger wouldn't serve her now. Action would. The witness still stood at the roadside, his phone now lowered, though the recording continued. He met her gaze. "You okay?" His voice was genuine. Veronica nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated. "They do this all the time. Just not to someone like you." The words hit harder than she expected. Because he was right. This wasn't new. She just had the power to do something about it. More officers arrived. Some looked at Kearns and his partner with barely concealed disdain. The lieutenant who had taken control of the situation turned back to Veronica. "Director Caldwell," he began carefully, "do you want to press charges personally, or—" Veronica shook her head. "This isn't personal. It's systemic." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I'll be filing an official report first thing in the morning, and I want internal affairs involved immediately." The lieutenant exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Understood." She wasn't finished. "I also want full access to their disciplinary records. Complete transparency." He hesitated. Veronica's stare didn't waver. "If you think I'll let this disappear, then you don't know who you're talking to." Silence. Then a reluctant nod. "I'll make the call." "Good." Her voice was cold, uncompromising. This wasn't about a single traffic stop. It was about all the ones that were never recorded. The video made the news before sunrise. It spread across social media, dissected frame by experts, crashing into the system with relentless force. By noon, the Department of Justice had announced an official investigation. Kearns was stripped of his badge and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. His partner was placed on indefinite suspension. The police department released a statement, one of those carefully crafted damage control responses, full of vague reassurances. But the world had already seen the truth, and truth had consequences. Veronica watched the reports from her office, fingers steepled under her chin. The story spread like wildfire. She knew what would come next. Calls, press conferences, political maneuvering. There would be people pretending to care while silently wishing she had just let it go. But she wasn't letting it go. Her phone vibrated. An unknown number. Normally she wouldn't answer. Tonight she made an exception. "Director Caldwell?" She recognized the voice instantly. The witness from that night. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're doing. Most people wouldn't." Veronica leaned back in her chair. A slow breath left her chest. "Most people don't have power." A pause. Then, quieter but firm, "But I do." And for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. Because justice doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people refuse to look away. So make sure you listen. If this story moved you, share it, speak, and never let the truth stay hidden.